Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharma swarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Today, we're discussing Sutras 1.19 to 1.22 with the focus on 19 and 20, which are extremely interesting, and there's a lot to discuss. And also Bryant's commentary on those sutras on pages 73 to 80. In our next class, date to be announced, not clear yet, but sometime next month, in the month of September, the assignment is to read Yoga Sutras 1.23 to 1.24, and Bryant's commentary thereon from pages 81 to 99. It's about 18 pages. He's having a field day because these are the sutras which first introduce the concept of God, the personal God, Ishvara. Not exactly the personal God, but anyway, that's complicated. But Ishvara, God of some sort. And there's a lot to discuss there. So we'll look at those next time. As I said, date to be announced. Now, last time we discussed 1.17 and 18, which explained respectively sampragnata samadhi and then asampragnata samadhi. Sampragnata samadhi in 1.17, which is a lower level samadhi, which should culminate in the highest goal of yoga philosophy, which is asampragnata samadhi, described in 1.18. Okay, that's the context. So now we get to 1.19. So please repeat after me. Bhava pratyayo videha prakriti layanam. Okay, Bryant says, here's his translation. For some people, those who are unembodied and those who are merged in matter. So those who are unembodied is Videha. They're the Videhas. And those who are merged in matter, Prakrtilayas. Then Bryant adds in parentheses, the state of sampragnata is characterized by absorption in subtle states of Prakriti. Okay, there's a lot to discuss here. Thing is, there's a lot of controversy about, first of all, this fundamental question of exactly how 1.19 relates to the previous two sutras. Sorry, just it's a little stuffy in here. So I'm turning down the temperature. Yeah, so I'm gonna go 72. Okay. There you go. Okay, so now, first question. Does 1.19 follow directly from 1.18, which talks about asampragnata samadhi? Or does it follow from 1.17, which explains sampragnata samadhi, the lower level samadhi? It might sound like it's a purely technical or academic issue, but in fact it's quite important. So let's look at the beginning of Bryant's commentary to get a handle on why this is important. This is page 73 of his commentary on 1.19. Although Vyasa and most of the other commentators understand this abstruse sutra as following the topic of Sutra 1.18, the immediately preceding one about asampragnata samadhi, and thus pointing to a type of asampragnata samadhi where only latent samskaras remain in the mind, this seems impossible given the nature of the states described in the sutra. We thus agree with Bhojaraja that this sutra continues from 1.17, elaborating on certain yogis whose minds are still absorbed in some state of Prakriti, paralleling the Prakritic attainments outlined there. The asampragnata samadhi of 1.18 involves uncouplement from Prakriti and thus cannot refer to the Prakritic states attained by the kind of practitioners referred to in the sutra. The type of quasi-samadhi indicated here is still connected with bhava. That's the first word in the sutra. Literally becoming, which I've translated as states of Prakriti. and points to a state that can also be attained by those other than practitioners of real yoga. The beings in this category remain absorbed in various subtle dimensions of Prakriti, and thus stranded, as it were, at various heights of supernormal attainments accrued from the yoga path. Thus, Bhojaraja considers the states indicated in the sutra to point to, quote, semblances of yoga. It appears to be yoga from the outside, but in fact, they're somehow falling short of the highest attainments of yoga. There's a lot more to discuss, but first, let's discuss this issue of why I put this A question mark before Sampragyata Samadhi, because different commentators have different views on this. Bryant says that Vyasa, who's like the mainstream standard earliest commentator on the Yoga Sutra, whom almost everyone accepts most of the time, he and most of the other traditional commentators, they take 1.19 to follow from 1.18, which in a way makes sense, but in another way doesn't. At least it doesn't seem to. Why? Because asampragyata samadhi is supposed to be the highest goal of yoga, which is basically realization of your nature as Purusha separate from the body-mind complex. So there can't be really any question of identifying with even a subtle form of Prakriti at that point. But 1.19 is specifically about two kinds of people. One is Videhas, the second is Prakrtilayas, both of which are merged with some subtle form of Prakriti. So Bryant's not able to square that circle. He says 1.19 can't follow from 1.18 directly because the states described in 1.19 aren't states of asampragyata samadhi. At best, they're states of sampragyata samadhi, in which there might be still some connection with Prakriti of some sort. Does that make sense? And so this is not just Bryant. He's pointing to one traditional commentator who agrees with him on this, or he follows that one traditional commentator, Bhojaraja is his name, Bhoja, Raja, Raja. So he found one traditional commentator to support it, and he's going with that. Swamiji, interestingly, in Raja Yoga, he sides with Vyasa and most of the other traditional commentators in taking 1.19 to follow from 1.18, and somehow it is explaining a state of asampragyata samadhi, but Swamiji doesn't really elaborate on how that's possible. I find the Bhojaraja Bryant reading to make more sense in some ways, and I want you to decide for yourself, and maybe you can think about how 1.19 might be describing a state of asampragyata samadhi. That would be interesting too. How might that make sense? We can defend the Vyasa Swamiji kind of line as well. But we can talk about that later. Now, let's go into a little bit more detail as to who exactly are these Videhas and these Prakrtilayas. Let's take them one at a time. So, next paragraph in Bryant's commentary. Patanjali here refers to two categories of such beings, the Videhas, those who are unembodied, and the Prakrtilayas, those who are merged in matter. Their common denominator is that these entities still maintain notions of self-identity that are connected with material, Prakritic existence. They identify with some form of Prakriti, even though it's no longer the gross body in the way that we are doing. So they're not as foolish as we are. But they're still not fully liberated either because they're identified with some subtler form of Prakriti. Yes, you can. But do you want to give the mic to him?
So, is this understanding that they have of these unembodied spirits or whatever people? Is this direct experience, or are they just talking? Is this just intellectual mumbo jumbo? Because I don't even see how it's relevant to us. I mean, we don't care what the unembodied spirits are doing or how it relates to us, as far as I can see.
Okay, so what's the relevance of this? Well, there are two questions here. One is, how do they know that these beings exist? Yeah. I think the answer is, meditative/spiritual experience. That yogis, evolved yogis, can actually directly perceive these Videhas and Prakrtilayas. And then the second question is, why does it matter to us? I see it this way, that Patanjali is basically warning us about pitfalls on the path of yoga And one of those pitfalls is getting stuck at a certain relatively high level, advanced stage, but then getting stuck there and not being able to attain liberation. And so unless we know what the obstacles and pitfalls are, we're not going to know what to avoid. I think that's the idea. Does that make sense? So don't become a Prakrtilaya or a Videha. That's kind of the...
I think that is extremely relevant to our studies, especially if we're thinking beyond this lifetime, and we're thinking of transitioning, and we're keeping our mind clear in the bridge state, then we want to study while we still have a body what could happen in that bridge state. So I get what you're saying, but like looking big picture, I want this information.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page, yeah. Okay, so if we take this to mean sampragyata samadhi, it's a certain kind of state of sampragyata samadhi. It's sampragyata samadhi involving identification with some subtle form of prakriti. And what's distinctive about it is that samskaras still remain. These latent mental impressions still remain. But they have achieved chitta vritti nirodha. That's why there's a semblance that they've achieved the highest goal. Chitta vritti nirodha means there are no conscious thoughts anymore. And many of these Videhas and Prakrtilayas actually make the mistake of thinking, I am liberated. This is mentioned actually by, I think Vachaspati Mishra. Oh no, Gaudapada, another, a different commentator. They say, one merged in the state thinks, I'm liberated. This is a type of ignorance. This reminds me of Neo-Advaitins. A lot of them think that, just saying Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman is enough to get liberation. When I was traveling in India, before I joined the order, I did a 6-month pilgrimage, and I was visiting these Himalayan foothills in Kodaikanal, and I walked into a bakery, and the woman there, who I think owned the shop, I was wearing this kind of clothes, monastic clothes, but white. And she said, what do you plan to do? I said, oh, I'm planning on joining the Ramakrishna mission, becoming a sannyasi. She said, oh, why go to all that trouble? I'm a disciple of Ramana Maharshi. And he told us to just dive into the Atman. And so again, it reminds me of that. It's like, it's not that easy. Spiritual life is not that easy. You can't just dive into the Atman. Some people can, but they're very few and far between. Let's put it that way. Okay, so what exactly are these Videhas? This is the first full paragraph in page 74. Bryant says, more specifically, Vyasa and Vachaspati Mishra identify the first category of beings mentioned by Patanjali, the Videhas, as the celestial beings. The Sanskrit term here is Devas, Deva, D-E-V-A. So this is not like God with a capital G. Arguably, there is no God with a capital G in Patanjali, but there's some form of God, and there's Ishvara. But this is not Ishvara. These are these, as Swamiji points out in his commentary, these are positions, offices, which any one of us, if we do the certain kind of karma, we ourselves can occupy the position of one of these devas, be it Indra or Agni or something like that, any of them. And we don't have physical bodies. But the key here is that these devas still identify with some subtle form of prakriti. And a lot of the commentators say they specifically identify with buddhi, the pure intelligence. And buddhi falls on the side of nature, prakriti, not the purusha. So in that sense, these Videhas are still not fully liberated because they're identified with a subtle form of prakriti. Okay? Now, as for the second category, Prakrtilayas, Brian explains this at the bottom of page 74. The commentators hold the second category mentioned by Patanjali in this sutra, those merged in prakriti, matter, to refer to entities who consider themselves to be either unmanifest primordial prakriti, herself, or buddhi, the first evolute from prakriti, or the second evolute, ahankara, or even the tanmatras, 5 subtle elements. In other words, more or less anyone who does not identify himself or herself as being the gross material body made of the 5 gross elements, but still identifies the self as being some other, more subtle aspect of prakriti, could be considered Prakrtilaya, merged in matter. So if we identify not with our physical bodies, but with some subtler form of prakriti, whatever that might be, manas, buddhi, ahankara, tanmatras, we are effectively a Prakrtilaya. Okay? And why are we falling short of the goal? Because the goal is to identify as Purusha, right? Which is completely separate from nature. So not even the most subtle form of nature is good enough. And some Prakrtilayas actually identify with Prakriti itself, which is the fundamental causal matrix out of which everything else comes. But that's still just Prakriti at the end of the day, right? So that's the problem. Okay. So now, Bryant does a little bit of a summing up on page 75. He says, whether we take bhava to be ignorance, samsara, or birth, it should be clear by now that the overall significance remains the same. Bhava points to the world of being or becoming, namely Prakriti. Thus, the Videhalayas and Prakrtilayas, I think that's a typo. It should be thus the Videhas and Prakrtilayas. This is page 75. I think I've discovered another typo. So the Videhas and Prakrtilayas, whether gods or yogis stranded on one of the levels of Sampragnata Samadhi outlined in the previous sutra, are beings who remain absorbed in one of the above evolutes of Prakriti until the activation of their samskaras eventually thrust them back into lower forms of samsara to experience the fruits of their previous activities. Why are they reborn eventually? Because those samskaras remain. It's because of samskaras that even us, what we're doing, everything we're doing is creating karma, which will also produce samskaras, latent mental impressions, which at the moment they're activated will make us feel strongly inclined to engage in the same kind of activities that resulted in those samskaras in the first place. So if we die with a whole set of samskaras, what does that mean? It means we're going to have to come back again to work out those samskaras as well, until we completely burn out all the samskaras in the state of asampragyata samadhi. Okay? So then he says, thus, despite difference in detail, the commentators agree that while such yogis may have transcended grosser notions of self-identity, they have not yet realized their true essential nature as Purusha, but still identify themselves with some other finer aspect of matter. And he goes on to say on page 76, this is regarding chitta vrittis. He says, these two categories of entities, so the Videhas and the Prakrtilayas, which we can perhaps refer to as imperfect yogis, exist in a state that approximate absolute freedom because they are free from the chitta vrittis, fluctuating states of mind, and their minds consist only of samskaras, subconscious impressions or latent propensities. So it's precisely because they don't have any chitta vrittis that they think that they're already liberated, many of these. But they're deceiving themselves. They are thus, from normal perspectives, highly evolved beings. This is actually important. Bryant is saying, look, some people, even especially these traditional commentators, make it seem as if these states are these, it's not very desirable to be a Prakrtilaya or a Videha. These are pitfalls to be avoided, as I mentioned earlier. It's true in a sense, but what Brian's pointing out is that it's actually still, these beings are highly evolved relative to us. Because we're stupidly identifying with these gross bodies, right? At least they're farther along than we are because they're identifying with these much subtler forms of Prakriti. And he adds toward the end of this section that it's even possible, at least according to some traditional commentators, to go from that state, whether it's as a Videha or a Prakrtilaya, to liberation. They don't necessarily have to be reborn. If they engage in spiritual practice as Videhas or Prakrtilayas, and then they get rid of those residual samskaras so that they don't have to come back again. And then they can just attain asampragyata samadhi and then attain the highest goal, which is realization of Purusha. So that's also interesting. These beings don't necessarily have to come back here. Most of them do because of those samskaras and because they're not doing those kinds of requisite spiritual practices. But there are some exceptions who don't have to be reborn and can actually go straight to the highest goal. Okay? Okay. I think that's enough on 1.19. So now we have a lot to discuss regarding 1.20. So please repeat after me. 1.20. Shraddha Virya, Smriti, Samadhi, Prajna, Purvaka, Itaresham. Okay. 5 terms are used here. Shraddha means faith. I've written that down here. Virya means energy, strength, vigor. Smriti, what does it mean? Different commentators have wildly different understandings of what smriti means. It literally means memory or recollection. Okay? But as we'll see soon, Hariharananda Āraṇya, one of the great modern Sankhya yogi monks, he has a very different interpretation, and I want to talk about that in some detail. Samadhi. Whenever we hear samadhi, there's so many different types of samadhi. What kind of samadhi is being referred to here? Pretty much everyone agrees that sampragyata samadhi is being referred to, not asampragyata, not the highest kind of samadhi, but sampragyata samadhi. One of the reasons is because that samadhi state is followed by what's called prajna, discernment, which is, I see it as a synonym for viveka. So discrimination between Purusha and Prakriti, which is a precondition for attaining the highest asampragyata samadhi. So that's how I render this. These 5 things, these 5 qualities, practices lead to, and this is sampragyata samadhi, and then discernment between Purusha and Prakriti, leading to asampragyata samadhi, which then leads to liberation. Okay? So how does 1.20 relate to 1.19 in the previous verses? Well, the previous verse talks about, depending on which commentator we're following, but if it's Bhojaraja and Bryant, the previous sutras talking about these different kinds of beings who have attained a state of sampragyata samadhi, but have kind of stalled there. And so 1.20 now is talking about, wait, there are other people who, if they avoid the pitfalls mentioned in the previous sutra, 1.19, and engage in these practices, these 5 practices, what happens to them? They're not reborn. They attain the highest asampragyata samadhi, which leads to liberation, realization of their true nature as Purusha, separate completely from Prakriti. So that's how 1.20 relates to 1.19. Other people who do engage in these wonderful spiritual yogic practices, they attain the highest goal, unlike the beings mentioned in the previous verse. Okay? Now, Brian actually doesn't say all that much, and let me be frank here. I published an article about 11 years ago on this sutra. It's called Yogic Mindfulness, Hariharananda Āraṇya's quasi-Buddhistic interpretation of Smriti in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra 1.20. So I've done a lot of research on this particular sutra and a lot of the background behind it. And I think a lot of it's really important and interesting. So I wanted to talk a little about that. Focusing on this question of what exactly does the word Smriti mean? But there are broader interpretive issues here, problems. Okay, the problem is as follows. Okay, according to 1.20, there are these 5 practices which lead to asampragyata samadhi and liberation, right? The problem is that in 2.28 to 3.7 of the Yoga Sutras, a different set of practices, or another set of practices, are described in great detail, which are famous. The Ashtanga Yoga, the 8-limbed yoga, the 8 limbs of yoga. Okay? What are those? Does anyone know? Yama, niyama. Yama means certain restraints, certain forms of self-restraint. 2, niyama, ethical observances. 3, asana, physical posture, how you should sit in meditation. 4, pranayama, breathing exercises. 5, pratyahara, which means sense control, sense restraint, withdrawal of the sense organs from sense objects. 6, dharana. Dharana means concentration. Dhyana is step 7, or limb 7, which means meditation, right? Deep meditation. And then samadhi is number 8, the final. Yeah, good. There you go. And the 8th and final one, limb of Ashtanga Yoga, is samadhi. Which kind of samadhi? Can you guess? It's sampragyata samadhi. Yeah, exactly. It's sampragyata samadhi. So now, there's a big problem for commentators. Everyone knows that the main practices taught in the Yoga Sutras is the Ashtanga Yoga, the 8 limbs of yoga, yama, niyama, and so on, which I just mentioned. Those are the ones leading to the highest goal. Now, suddenly in 1.20, Patanjali is giving us a different set of 5 practices which lead to the highest goal. So how in the world do these 5 practices mentioned in 120 relate to the 8 practices, yama, niyama, etc., which comprise the Ashtanga Yoga mentioned in 2.28 to 3.7? This is the interpretive problem. So now, different commentators have come up with different ways of answering this question. Okay, I was thinking of actually writing all this on the board, but there's not enough room on the board. I need 2 boards. Okay. Oh yeah, well, all right. Take another half hour just to write it on the board. So let me try to explain, and I hope it's not too confusing. Here's how most traditional commentators answer this question or resolve this problem. They say, simple. Each of the practices mentioned in 1.20 just is a synonym for one of the practices in the Ashtanga Yoga. They equate. And how do they do it? This samadhi mentioned here in 1.20 is identical to the samadhi mentioned, which is the 8th limb of Ashtanga Yoga. And then what they do cleverly is they say, okay, so that means the preceding term, if this is the, so let me write this down maybe. Okay. So if this is the 8th limb, right, of Ashtanga Yoga, AY, what do you think Smriti is? 7th limb. Why not make this dhyana, the 7th limb? Meditation.
Gonna run out of numbers here.
And then Vidya. Why don't we make this the 6th limb and call it the same thing as Dharana? And then how about Shraddha, faith, meaning the 5th, which is Pratyahara? So yeah, Dinesh is saying,
That's a bit of a stretch.
why do you think it's a bit of a stretch?
Shraddha is Pratyahara.
Right, you're really, yeah,
This way of doing it.
Yeah.
Seems flimsy.
right. It's a stretch. It seems like a stretch because the meanings, the natural meanings of these terms don't correspond very well to the meanings of the terms or the practices in Ashtanga Yoga that they're trying to map them onto, right? Apart from samadhi, which is kind of obvious, it seems like that would be easy to identify them. But
Poetically,
metaphorically or something, but yeah, I mean, so they've done it. They've tried their best. More power to them, huh?
Limbs 1 through 4, they're not related to those.
No. So then they're saying that those are these are like just describing the higher level Ashtanga Yoga practices. Basically, that's the way that these traditional commentators handle it. And then if you want the lower level practices, wait till 2.28 to 3.7, and then you get those. Okay, so this is how the traditional commentators handle it. Okay, and there are other traditional commentators like they used to think it was Shankara. I think that now they refer to the author as pseudo Shankara because it's most likely not the Shankara we know as the codifier of the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta. But his view is, yes, smriti means memory, recollection of what? Of scripture. So recollection of scriptural teachings, the Yoga Sutras, for instance. And Swamiji, just in one word, translates smriti as memory, but doesn't explain in his commentary memory of what. It's just memory. Now, why do I think Hariharananda Āraṇya's interpretation is so interesting? Because it gives a completely different interpretation of the term smriti. And more interestingly, well, that itself is, I think, already worth the price of admission. But then secondly, he's giving a completely different answer to the question of how exactly these 5 practices in 1.20 relate to the 8 practices in Ashtanga Yoga, later in the Yoga Sutra. he doesn't do the mapping that these traditional commentators do. So what does he do? So let's talk about all this. But let me give you a little bit of background first. Does anyone here know much about Buddhism? Have you read like parts of the Tipitaka, the teachings of Buddha? Some of it, yeah. So do these terms ring any bells? These 5 terms? Every single one of these terms is found in the Buddhist scriptures, in some of the earliest Buddhist scriptures, including the Tipitaka, which is the recording of Buddha's own teachings. This is quite interesting. How? Why is there this overlap? Exactly the same 5 terms. So many scholars think that Yoga Sutra was influenced by Buddhism, that it's a post-Buddhistic text. And so in Buddhism, you find these 5 practices. Yoga Sutra is influenced by Buddhism, and so Yoga Sutras incorporates these Buddhist practices and kind of make them their own. So that's one view. Hariharananda Āraṇya has a slightly different view. He agrees that there's a deep parallel between these Buddhist practices and the yogic practices. But he says that's not a coincidence, and it's not because Yoga Sutras were influenced by Buddhism. It's the other way around. Why? He's ingenious. He says, looking at stories about the Buddha's spiritual practices and his different gurus, one of his gurus' name was Āraṇya Kalama. And some texts consider this Kalama to be a Sankhyan. And Sankhya, many of you probably know that it's considered to be the most ancient school of Indian philosophy, preceding obviously yoga, but also preceding Buddhism. So what Hariharananda says is, hey, look, one of Buddha's teachers, Āraṇya Kalama, was a Sankhyan, and it's mentioned in the Tipitaka that this Kalama taught him these 5 practices: Shraddha, Vidya, Smriti, Samadhi, Prajna. And so Buddha learns these 5 practices from the Sankhyans, and then yoga philosophy may or may not have been influenced by Buddhism, but the point is Buddhism itself was influenced by Sankhya, and so it's this kind of funny situation where... so in any case, even if that's true, even if it's true that Sankhya is the most ancient philosophy, that Sankhya is the source of these 5 practices, and that Buddha was taught these practices by a Sankhyan, even so, Hariharananda admits that it was Buddhism and Buddha who popularized the practice of what he calls mindfulness. It's obvious, right? Nowadays, these mindfulness retreats are ubiquitous, and it's vipassana and all these things. That's all Buddhist mindfulness, right? So Hariharananda Āraṇya, what he says is, we should interpret smriti, the term smriti, in 1.20 of the Yoga Sutra, in terms of the Buddhist concept of smriti. So Buddha spoke in Pali, and the Tipitaka is written in the Pali language. And Pali is a kind of corruption of Sanskrit. And so Buddha taught, there's a great discourse called Satipatthana Sutta, discourse on mindfulness, or on the foundations of sati, S-A-T-I. That is the Pali term for the Sanskrit term smriti. It's the same term, it's just the Pali term is sati. Just because I said it's a corruption of Sanskrit. And the Buddha in this discourse, Satipatthana Sutta, he explains mindfulness as mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of breath as you inhale and exhale, mindfulness of the thoughts that arise in your mind that arise and pass away. Did I say mindfulness of feelings already? I did. No, mindfulness of feelings also. So different kinds, there are different objects of mindfulness, but that's the main thing. And what does mindfulness mean, according to Buddha? Non-judgmental awareness. Non-judgmental awareness. Not just awareness. No, non-judgmental. That's really important. As spiritual aspirants, sometimes we're too judgmental toward ourselves. It's one thing not to be judgmental toward others, and that's a good practice. But sometimes even when we're not judgmental toward others, we can be judgmental toward ourselves, and that's also not helpful in our spiritual life. So mindfulness, according to Buddhism, is non-judgmental awareness of whatever's happening at the level of body and mind. Because the moment you're judgmental, what happens? You become emotionally invested. And you either, if it's a bad thought, what you consider to be bad, what happens? You feel guilty, or you get angry, or you get upset about the fact, why am I thinking this thought? Right? So better to just take a step back from whatever's happening at the level of body-mind. Not to judge what's happening, but to just take a step back. Because what happens when you do that? You deprive that thought or feeling of its power over you. It only has power so long as you obsess over it. But the moment you just become detached, take a step back from it, it loses that power. Okay? So this is Buddhist mindfulness. Mindfulness means non-judgmental awareness of what's happening at the level of body, mind, feeling. Okay? Now, Hariharananda Āraṇya says, what smriti means, this third practice in 1.20, is best understood not as memory or recollection, but as mindful awareness. And he explains 4 different kinds of mindful awareness. Okay, I talk about all this in detail in my article. The first one comes closest to the standard Buddhist practice, mindfulness of whatever thoughts arise in the mind. Okay, non-judgmental awareness of whatever thoughts arise in the mind. But Hariharananda Āraṇya adds 3 other forms of mindfulness practice, which you don't find in Buddhism, for reasons that should be clear soon enough. Okay, so the second form of mindfulness, the mindful resolve always to keep the object of meditation uppermost in the mind. Okay, this is also ingenious, I think. Because what's he doing? This is the key. Understanding B is the key to understanding how Hariharananda Āraṇya gives a novel answer to the question of how the practices mentioned in 1.20 relate to the Ashtanga Yoga mentioned later in the Yoga Sutras. His answer is, these traditional commentators who just equate smriti with dhyana, the 7th limb of Ashtanga Yoga, that's too, what was the word you used? That's too much of a stretch. It's not plausible to just identify them. But there's still an intimate connection between the practices mentioned in 1.20 and the 8 practices mentioned in the Ashtanga Yoga later. He says, specifically, that we can start with Shraddha. He's saying, Shraddha, you need Shraddha, faith. Faith in what? That also, different commentators have different views on this, but one of the commentators says you should have faith in the highest goal of asampragata samadhi and realization of your true nature as Purusha, something like that. That faith is a precondition for even getting off the ground with Ashtanga Yoga, the 8 practices mentioned in the 8-limbed yoga, right? Without that faith, you can't get off the ground with Ashtanga Yoga. Okay, so that's, you see, he's not equating, he's not mapping, but he's still intimately linking the practices in 1.20 with the later practices mentioned. Secondly, vidya, energy. You have to be full of energy to practice what? Ashtanga Yoga, right? Now we get to smriti. And he's saying here, smriti does not mean dhyana. It's not just the 7th limb. He says something much more subtle. He says that smriti is the precondition for attaining or getting established in a true state of dhyana. So arriving at this 7th limb of Ashtanga Yoga is very difficult. And he says that smriti, mindfulness, mindful awareness, is what's necessary in order to achieve this state of dhyana, this high state of dhyana. And specifically he has in mind this, B, the mindful resolve always to keep the object of meditation uppermost in the mind. See how that's not exactly the same thing as dhyana? Dhyana is meditating on whatever that object is. Typically, it's either going to be Purusha itself or Ishvara, God. Okay? Yeah.
Fair to say that like these and 120 are qualities or an attitude that a practitioner or a spiritual aspirant needs to have in order to do the 8 limbs?
Yeah, and maybe master the 8 limbs. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, exactly. Okay. And so the way I'd put it, philosophers, they distinguish between first order and second order kinds of activities. Dhyana is a first order act. I am meditating on an object, whether that's my higher self, the Purusha, or on God, right? Or on a mantra. B, this mindfulness practice, smriti, is the second order practice of making sure the mind is constantly thinking of whatever that object of meditation is. Do you see?
Noticing if it strays and coming back.
Exactly, yeah. So it's also like, it's keeping guard, keeping sentry. It's a second order guard. Making sure, are you sure Sri Ramakrishna, one time when he's doing spiritual practice, when he's trying to meditate on God, he imagines that there's this very delicate silk thread tying him to the foot of his Ishtadevata. So that even if the mind slightly deviates, wanders, what happens? It pulls on that, it tugs on that thread, and then of course his Ishtadevata, the God he worships, the toe might be injured. So he's always very, very cautious. So it's an interesting metaphorical way of thinking about this second order mindfulness practice. There are different ways of making sure that you're actually focused. Another example, Sri Ramakrishna, when Rani Rashmani, the lady, she's conducting some kind of worship of Kali, but her mind is somewhere completely, somewhere else, something on something very worldly. And Sri Ramakrishna slaps her to get her back on track, because he could tell that her mind was wandering. That's another second order practice. I wouldn't recommend it. I'm going to get in trouble anyway. All right. So that's the second kind of mindfulness practice that Hariharananda talks about. So this term smriti encompasses all four of these mindfulness practices. First one is most akin to the standard Buddhist practice of mindfulness, non-judgmental awareness of thoughts. Second one is a second order practice of making sure that your mind doesn't stray from the object of meditation. Third is what he calls vachya vachaka smriti. Here, it's mindful, japa. He brings in the practice of japa, which means mental repetition of a mantra. Which mantra? Pranava. That's the mantra recommended a bit later in the Yoga Sutras. We're going to come to it. Pranava means Om. So mental repetition of the mantra Om. But what does the Om signify? Ishvara, God. Thinking of Om as you repeat it as God. That itself is a kind of mindfulness practice, vachya vachaka. Vachaka means the word signifying some ultimate reality. So that corresponds to pranava, the Om. And vachya is that which is denoted by the term Om, which is what? God. So vachya vachaka smriti. As you mentally repeat the mantra Om, keep in mind at the same time what the Om signifies, namely God. That's another mindfulness practice. Okay. There's a good reason why this is not in Buddhism, because Buddhism, there's no real place for God in Buddhism, obviously. Okay. And then the fourth practice, last but not least, is what Hariharananda Āraṇya calls Viveka Smriti. Viveka Smriti. Viveka means discrimination, right? Between Purusha and Prakriti. So this is identification with Purusha as the detached witness of Prakriti. So I am not Prakriti, I'm not any even of the subtle forms of Prakriti mentioned in the previous verse, the previous Sutra 1.19. I am the eternally liberated Purusha, completely free from the entanglements of nature, of Prakriti. That's the fourth kind of mindfulness practice. Again, you won't find that in Buddhism. Why? Does anyone know why? Why wouldn't you find the fourth kind of mindfulness practice in Buddhist mindfulness?
Separate self.
The what?
Separate self.
Yeah, in Buddhism, there's no self in Buddhism, exactly. Buddha taught the doctrine of anatta in Pali, which means anatma, the no-self doctrine. There's no abiding eternal self in Buddhism.
Do they have mantra repetition in Buddhism?
Some forms, later forms, like Tantric Buddhism and, yeah. So those things come in later, you'll find. But in the original form, you don't find that stuff at all, okay? Okay, and so no self. Then there's this tricky, we're not going to go into this because this is like a whole nother semester-long course or something, but like Buddhists also believe in karma and rebirth. How can you square that with the fact that there's no eternal self? If there's no self, what exactly is reborn? That's very complicated, and I don't want to get it. But that is like, Vedantins have these big debates, and other Hindu schools of thought who believe in karma and rebirth, but also believe in an eternal Atman. They argue with Buddhists on this point, saying that you can't accept karma and rebirth and also deny an enduring self. You can't have both at the same time. So that's a complicated issue. But here's what I want to say about this fourth mindfulness practice. One of the virtues of believing in an eternal Atman and at the same time practicing mindfulness is that you have a strong metaphysical anchor or foundation for your mindfulness practice. Okay? This is not like a criticism of Buddhism, but it's just, I think it's a difference in temperament. So, in Buddhism, Buddha tells you, practice non-judgmental awareness of your feelings, thoughts, and whatever. And you're doing it, right? But as what? Who is the witness? Who is engaging in this non-judgmental awareness? Right? And Buddhists, I think, will just typically say mind. The mind is watching mind. Mind is watching, observing feelings. Right? But in Vedanta, in Yoga, in Sankhya, their answer is, by taking a step back from what's happening at the level of body-mind, you're able to identify with your own true spiritual nature. You can identify with, when you are being a witness to your thoughts, you are actually, part of the practice is identifying with your deeper spiritual nature as Purusha. You see? Just like in Advaita Vedanta, there's a Sakshi, there's the Atman. In yoga, in Sankhya and yoga, there's Purusha. And as Purusha is actually a metaphysical witness of nature, of Prakriti, right? So there's a kind of, there's a metaphysical basis for the mindfulness practice that arguably is missing in Buddhism. Does that make sense? And so depending on your temperament as a spiritual aspirant, one form of mindfulness practice might be more helpful to you. If you don't believe in if you don't want to believe in anything transcendental, anything metaphysical, Buddhist mindfulness might be for you. And if you like the idea of a mindfulness practice that's anchored in some metaphysical foundation, an Atman, Purusha, then either yogic mindfulness or Vedantic mindfulness could be more helpful for you. Okay? Okay, so these are the... Let me read to you Hariharananda's, what he says about this fourth kind of mindfulness practice, Viveka Smriti. He says, Viveka Smriti is the foremost sadhana. He says of all these four, it's the most important form of mindfulness. He says, in this form of practice, one makes the mindful resolve, quote, as I watch the thoughts arising in the mind, I will not allow any extraneous thoughts to enter the mind, and I will always remain identified with my true nature as the Purusha or pure consciousness, the seer witness of all thoughts and objects. This is the foremost means of attaining tranquility and purification of mind. And then he says, the Yoga Taravali states, watching nature with an attitude of detached indifference, one must uproot all thoughts with great care. This is the highest form of smriti sadhana. That's the highest form of mindfulness. Okay? So, overall, what's he doing? He's saying that all five of these practices... well, actually, Keshav, you were asking about how we can characterize these five, and we're saying that these are the attitudes to have in order to practice Ashtanga Yoga. That doesn't apply to Samadhi, right? Because Samadhi, everybody will agree, is the Samadhi, the eighth limb of Ashtanga Yoga. Right? Okay. So that corresponds to the eighth limb of Ashtanga Yoga. I don't think there's controversy there.
Which one's not higher? The
Prajna?
Samprajñata Samadhi is the higher one.
No, it's the lower one.
Yeah, so, but is it saying that you need this lower or some kind of like, or it's inevitable maybe for a lower form of Samadhi before the higher form of Samadhi?
What's your question? Sorry?
Is it possible that like, or inevitable that you'll have this lower Samprajñata Samadhi before having the higher Asamprajñata?
Of course, it's always going to precede it.
So then
Yes.
So then it becomes a quality or an attitude that you would have before, like.
No, but the thing is, remember that the 8th limb of Ashtanga Yoga is also sampragyata samadhi. It's not asampragyata. Yeah, remember yeah. And so in both cases, so the culmination of Ashtanga Yoga is sampragyata samadhi, which is not the highest goal, but it will lead to the highest goal, as long as you don't mess up. And then here, after sampragyata samadhi, the 8th limb of Ashtanga Yoga, then there's pragya, this further.
So is that the 9th limb?
Well, it's kind of like explaining. It's an interesting, I mean, you can think about it as this pragya, this 5th term pragya in 1.20, could be a way of, it's a kind of connecting link between, okay, well, now I've achieved the goal of Ashtanga Yoga, which is sampragyata samadhi, but that's not the highest goal. So what do you need? Exercise pragya, discernment, this constant discrimination between Purusha and Prakriti. Your true nature is Purusha and everything else, which falls on the side of nature. Then what happens? Finally, you attain asampragyata samadhi, and then you attain liberation.
Is that the same as nirvikalpa samadhi?
It's a good question. Nirvikalpa samadhi is a term used. It's the highest goal according to classical Advaita Vedanta, or at least a certain school of classical Advaita Vedanta. There are similarities, but there are also differences. And so one of the differences, for instance, is that according to classical Advaita Vedanta, there's only one non-dual self, which you realize in the state of Nirvikalpa samadhi. But each one of us has a different Purusha. So in asampragyata samadhi, you realize your true nature as the Narayana Purusha, whereas if I'm lucky enough to attain asampragyata samadhi, I realize my nature as Medhananda Purusha. Yeah. Okay?
So they're confused. They're not as good as Vedanta.
Ouch. Okay, says the Vedantan, yeah. Right, exactly. Okay, so any questions about what I've said? I think that one thing that's interesting about Hariharananda Āraṇya's reading, understanding of Smriti, is that, number one, it gives a completely different way of explaining the connection between the 5 practices mentioned in 1.20 with the 8 practices of Ashtanga Yoga. And secondly, he beautifully bridges 2 very important contemporary spiritual traditions, right? Buddhist mindfulness and yoga, both of which are raging in the West. And how are they connected? Well, he gives us a really interesting way of connecting these 2 things, these 2 different spiritual traditions. Yeah. So yogic mindfulness, that's why I call my article Yogic Mindfulness. Mm.
So once a being goes into the Purusha, is that, according to Vedanta, are they able to then, can they inhabit a body after that?
Give her the mic and then so that other people
Can they inhabit a body after that if they choose? Like not as a rebirth, but like as an enlightened being, like that would come here for a purpose? Or once you go in the Purusha, are you just gone?
Right. Well, first of all, I think the language of going into the Purusha is probably not quite accurate. It's not really about going into anything, but realizing your true nature as Purusha, which is eternally liberated, nitya mukta.
Okay, so it's not like an after-death state or in-between state. It's while you're alive?
Well, that's complicated, and then different scholars have different views on this. I'm inclined to think that Jivan Mukti is not really a possibility in yoga philosophy. Mm-hmm. There's a concept called Pratiprasava, Prati, Prasava. And this term has been interpreted, it'll come later in the Yoga Sutras. It's a culmination of yogic practice. And it literally means a kind of devolution, like where everything, like the different, our gross body and even our mind is composed of the 5 elements in different permutations. And one mainstream interpretation of Pratiprasava means the body and the mind go back into their original elements, which seems to suggest you're not going to be alive anymore. It's like a rotting corpse, right? More or less. In which case, the implication seems to be that you only attain full liberation upon the death of the body. Hariharananda Āraṇya, interestingly, he started an ashrama called Kapil Math, which I visited twice. There's a wonderful Swami there now named Bhaskararananda Āraṇya, who's a disciple of Hariharananda Āraṇya. So I stayed there for a week one time, a long time ago, and I stayed for a few years ago as well. And Hariharananda Āraṇya, how did he leave his body? He starved himself. He just stopped eating. And even some Jaina monks do that as well when they feel like they're ready to leave. And so this also kind of I think supports the view that to get the final separation from Purusha, you need to leave the body. Yes. Okay. Thank you. And other questions?
Go back to Purusha
Mm-hmm.
and give me the definition of it.
Oh, Purusha is the eternal self,
State. Okay.
separate from the body-mind complex, separate from anything in nature.
Okay, but we were talking about just now what she was asking, whether, and you started explaining, she was asking if it's a state after or it's a realization, and you were saying...
We are always the Purusha. Our problem is we
Right.
suffer from ignorance. We are ignorant of the fact that we are Purusha.
Right, so, but that goes, okay, what she was just asking about and being the state, I'm trying to remember, is you have to, they're saying that has to go away, that it has to be different. There's a process in which the ignorance is demolished in order to enter into
Yeah, but that's the
full-
whole point of all these practices and Ashtanga yoga and all these things.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
Exactly.
correct,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, Kesha, I think there are online questions as well. Okay,
What I have first.
be discriminating.
What
Okay.
what is Ishvara in this yoga system? Is
Yes.
Ishvara Purusha? Is it Prakriti? Is it the weird third
It's
thing?
it's a special kind of Purusha. That's why I've assigned 18, 19 pages from, because the next sutra is going to talk about Ishvara and explain what Ishvara is. But yeah, it's not the traditional personal God that we're used to, like to whom you pray, or at least many commentators writing on the Yoga Sutras don't think so. But that's part of the controversy. And Bryant is a Vaishnava practitioner. And he thinks that Ishvara actually comes much closer to the traditional personal God than most commentators allow. So there's actually some complexity and interpretive controversy about that. But we'll talk about that in great detail in the next class. Yeah, online question. You can, okay. Mm-hmm.
3. Why are there different interpretations of the Yoga Sutras?
Why are there? See, sutra, what does sutra mean? I think we talked about this at the beginning of the class. Sutra means literally thread. They're extremely laconic statements, comprised of very few words, very few syllables. And because of that, sometimes key words are missing. Like you notice, one of the big questions was how exactly does 1.19 relate to the previous sutras? Does it follow from 1.18 or from 1.17? Because they're so succinct, different commentators can read different things into it. They can give different interpretations saying, no, it doesn't make sense that 1.19 follows from 1.18 because how can that be the state of asampragata samadhi if you're still identified with the subtle form of prakriti? Another person saying, no, but it's more logical to think that it's flowing from the previous sutra. So, there are many different examples of this, how a single sutra can generate many different interpretations depending on how you read the text as a whole, what your own preconceptions are, and there are a lot of different reasons why different people have different interpretations of these different sutras. Yes. Other questions? And anyone here? Do you have your hand up? No. Yeah. Do you have a question? No. Okay. Anyone else? No. Okay. Then we can take another online question.
Does Patanjali use samadhi as a catch-all for the 5 different types of samadhi?
What are the 5 different types of samadhi?
That you were, I guess maybe 2 classes ago, you talked about different types of spiritual
I see.
meditation or samadhi type things in which there are different levels of identification with
Oh,
objects.
asmita and those other things, yeah.
maybe
But those are all
that's what
forms of
they're referring to.
sampragyanta samadhi. Yeah, so this sampragyanta samadhi would encompass all of those, exactly, yeah.
And then this one's a nice little hypothetical. Will the Swamis of the Vedanta Society be undisturbed even if all the scriptures of Vedanta, yoga, all knowledgeable and devotional scriptures vanish from the world physically and mentally from memory?
And mentally, wow, that's intense.
If all the scriptures go away, will the Swamis be content still?
Wow, I feel like this is a trick question. If I say yes, then they'll say, how dare you? You don't have any faith in the scriptures. And if I say no, they'll say, see, you're not a real yogi. You get disturbed by these small things. So I choose not to answer the question. How about that? They're trying to get me. They're trying to trap me. Entrapment. Okay, any other questions? All right, good. Thanks, guys. So I don't know what the date of the next class is, but as I said, I'll repeat one more time. What's the assignment? We're going to be reading Yoga Sutra 1.23 and 1.24, pages 81 to 99 of Bryant's commentary, and we'll be focusing on Ishvara, this key concept of God. Who or what is God, and what is the relevance or role of God in yogic practice? Okay, any last questions online or no?
The person who asked that question said thank you.
Ooh, wow. Well played, Medhananda. All right. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.